There's a moment that happens after an avoidant person hurts someone they were close to, and it's almost never the moment people expect. It's not a fight. It's not a confrontation. It's just silence, sudden, total, and confusing. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why that silence, the one that feels like the clearest proof they never cared, is actually one of the least reliable signals you'll ever try to read. Here's the part that should stop you before you finish writing the story you're probably already telling yourself. It would be so much simpler if staying away meant they didn't care. That explanation is clean. It closes the loop fast, and it lets you stop wondering. What actually tends to be true is stranger than that, harder to sit with. And if you stay for the rest of this, probably going to change how you read every silence that comes after this one. You've likely run through every explanation already, probably more than once, usually late at night, that they never really cared in the first place. That you were too much, too needy, too intense for someone built the way they're built. That the moment things got real, they found an exit and took it without a second thought. The way people do when something was never that important to begin with. It's a tidy story. It's also the one that hurts the most, because it makes their silence a referendum on your worth instead of what it usually actually is. Here's the thing almost nobody tells you about an avoidant person who hurt you and then disappeared. What their absence looks like from where you're standing and what it actually means underneath are very rarely the same thing. And the gap between those two things is exactly where most people get stuck for months, sometimes years, without ever realizing they're standing in it. If that sounds like something you want to believe just to soften what happened, stay with me. This isn't comfort, it's mechanism. Understanding what's actually driving their distance is the difference between carrying a story about yourself that isn't true for the rest of this relationship's aftermath, or finally seeing clearly enough to set it down for good. To be clear, this isn't a video telling you they're secretly suffering more than you are, or that their absence is proof they still love you and just can't say it. It's about understanding what's actually happening inside someone whose instinct, when they've caused pain, is to vanish rather than repair. Because once you understand that instinct, their silence stops being a mystery and starts being something far more specific and far more explainable. Let's get into it. Most people assume that hurting someone creates an urge to make it right. It's the instinct most of us grow up with. You cause pain, you feel guilty. The guilt pulls you back toward the person to fix it. For an avoidant person, hurting someone they were close to often creates the exact opposite urge. An urge to get as far away from the evidence of it as humanly possible. Not because they don't feel the weight of what happened, but because facing you now means facing a version of themselves they genuinely don't know how to look at directly. The person who caused pain. The person who wasn't enough, wasn't brave enough, wasn't emotionally available enough to do better in the moment it actually mattered. Staying away isn't them dodging you specifically. It's them dodging that reflection. And you simply happen to be standing in front of the mirror. This is a part that rarely gets explained clearly, and it's the part that changes everything once it clicks. Shame, for an avoidant person, doesn't usually produce an approach response the way it might in someone more securely attached. Someone with a more secure attachment style might feel guilty and move toward repair. Reach out, apologize, sit in the discomfort long enough to actually make things right, even if it's uncomfortable. An avoidant nervous system reads that same guilt as another threat to survive, and survival, for that system, means distance. So the very feeling that should be pulling them toward you is underneath the surface, the exact thing pushing them further away. It's not logical. It's not fair to you, and it was never meant to be fair. Nervous systems don't run on fairness, but it is consistent, and once you see it clearly, a lot of confusing, contradictory behavior starts to make a strange kind of sense. There's another layer underneath this worth naming, because it goes deeper than just guilt about one specific moment. Many avoidant people carry a quiet belief, often formed long before you ever met them, sometimes decades before, that they are fundamentally difficult to love well, that eventually the people closest to them end up hurt, disappointed, or exhausted by trying to reach them. When that belief gets confirmed by something that actually happened, something they actually did to you, it doesn't just create guilt, it creates a kind of proof of the exact thing they always suspected about themselves, sitting there now in plain sight, instead of just as a fear in the background. And rather than test whether that proof is really true by staying and doing the repair work, the safer move to their nervous system, if not to logic, is to disappear before the proof has a chance to get any stronger, any more undeniable. This is why the timeline so rarely makes sense from the outside looking in. If they were simply indifferent, if they truly felt nothing, you'd expect the silence to feel clean, uncomplicated, easy for them to maintain without effort. But indifference doesn't usually explain the small leaks that show up later, weeks or months in. A story watched within seconds of posting, a message typed out and then never sent, a mutual friend casually mentioning they asked how you're doing, almost in passing, like it didn't mean anything. Those aren't the marks of someone who feels nothing. They're the marks of someone managing a feeling they don't know how to approach directly. So they approach it sideways instead, from a distance that still lets them look without ever being caught looking. Here's where most people go wrong trying to make sense of all this. Some conclude the silence means they never really mattered at all, and use that story to close the door completely, sometimes before they've actually grieved what happened or given themselves room to feel the loss properly. Others conclude the opposite, that the depth of the silence must mean the depth of the love underneath it, and use that story to keep waiting indefinitely for a return that requires something the avoidant person hasn't yet learned how to do, and might not learn for a very long time. Both conclusions skip the same crucial detail. Their staying away is not primarily a message about you. It's a management strategy for something happening entirely inside them, one you were never given access to and were never going to be, at least not without them doing work they haven't started yet and may never start at all. There's also something worth understanding about the guilt itself, because it rarely resolves on its own just by waiting it out in silence. For many avoidant people, distance doesn't shrink the discomfort of having hurt someone. It just moves that discomfort out of view, where it doesn't have to be looked at daily, which means the guilt doesn't actually get processed. It gets stored. Some avoidant people carry that stored weight for a long time, in a way that quietly colors how they show up in whatever relationship comes next, still unresolved, still unaddressed, just relocated somewhere further from your sight, and eventually further from your own conscious awareness too. This isn't your responsibility to fix or wait around for, and it was never meant to be. But it does explain why an apology, if it ever comes at all, so often arrives long after it could have changed anything meaningful, and often only once enough time has passed that facing it finally feels survivable to them. None of this means you should sit around hoping the guilt eventually does its work and brings them back changed, healed, and ready. That a bet made entirely on someone else's timeline, with your present life sitting as the stake on the table. What it does mean is that the story you might be telling yourself right now, that you weren't worth staying for, that the silence is proof of how little you actually matter to them, is very likely the wrong story. Not because you're owed a kinder one out of some sense of fairness, but because it simply doesn't match what's actually driving behavior like this. The truth is less flattering to them, and considerably less painful to you, than either extreme version. They hurt you. They know it, somewhere underneath the silence. And they don't yet have the tools to stand in front of that fact without running from it. Here's what matters most if you're the one living inside that silence right now. Try and make sense of it. Their absence is not a verdict on how much you were worth loving well. It's a reflection of how poorly equipped they currently are to face having failed at loving you well in that specific moment with the tools they had available at the time. That gap between failing to love someone well and being unworthy of love altogether is enormous. And it's a gap that grief tends to collapse if you're not careful, quietly turning "they couldn't do it" into "I wasn't enough for it to be done," which is a very different and much crueler sentence. So you have two honest paths forward from here. You can hold the more accurate story, that this was about their capacity, not your worth, and let that understanding quietly close the loop, whether or not they ever come back to say the things they should have said long before now. That closure doesn't require their participation, their apology, or their growth. It only requires you seeing the situation clearly, on your own, without waiting for them to confirm it. Or, if some part of you is still holding space for a real repair someday, you can let that space exist without it running your life in the meantime, without checking their profile, without waiting up, without pausing your own healing on the chance that someday they'll find the courage this actually required. Space held quietly, for your own sake, is very different from a life put entirely on hold for someone else's growth. Both paths are valid. Neither one requires you to hate them in order to walk it, and neither one requires you to excuse what happened either. What matters most is that you stop measuring your own worth by the size of someone else's fear, because the goal was never to make them face what they did. The goal is to end up somewhere solid either way, carrying an honest story about what actually happened, instead of the false one their silence keeps quietly tempting you to believe. And that choice starts right now.